What's the scariest story you heard a child tell about there? Maybe not exactly scary, but definitely weird. When I was little, I had an imaginary friend. She had light brown hair, wore a nightgown, and, strangest of all, her eyes were stars. Years later, my niece was living in my old childhood home. She told me she had a friend who missed me and asked why I had gone away. Curious, I asked who it was. She described my old imaginary friend exactly. It was incredibly eerie. Edit. Apparently, some people find this scary. I guess I underestimated it. When my son was first learning to talk, he kept telling us about someone, or something, he called Purple Mommy. At first, we thought it was just an imaginary friend, but the details were unsettling. Purple Mommy is all purple with long hair and bright white eyes. At the time, he sometimes mixed up purple and black, so maybe she was all black. She picks him up at night and turns off the lights. Often, we'd find him out of his crib in the morning, crawling over the railing to the floor, long before he could really walk. Sometimes his room lights were off too, even though he's terrified of the dark. Purple Mommy needs a bandage because she's covered in blood. She has no mouth, and she can take her head off. She really doesn't like Daddy. He told us these things for over a year. Whenever we asked where she was, he would point to the same corner of his room, just behind his open closet door. Almost every night, he'd wake up crying. One particularly rough night, my wife asked him what was wrong. His answer? Purple Mommy won't let me sleep. My son had an imaginary friend named Ganga. She lived in the pond nearby, had duck feet, hair covering her entire face, and ate through a slit in her neck. According to him, we were expecting her any minute for dinner. He was completely calm about this horrifying creature. Yet, somehow, he had recurring nightmares about a puppy sneaking into his room. Kids are weird. My youngest niece had an imaginary friend, and when my sister told me about it, she said, "Ask her what she looks like." So I asked, "Okay, what does she look like?" Her answer, "Broken pieces." I blinked. "Oh, why is she broken, sweetie?" "She fell from our tree." "Nope." "Sorry, sis. You're on your own with that one." My cousin, who was a few years younger than me, had an imaginary friend named Mookie. Mookie wasn't human, more like some kind of alien or monster. I used to get creeped out whenever I heard a noise behind me at my grandparents' house, and my cousin would just calmly say, "It's only Mookie. He just wants to see you." I'm talking to MS. Lady. Who's MS? Lady. The white lady with black eyes and long fingernails. At that moment, I started frantically looking up the nearest exorcist. When my daughter was a toddler, she started talking about a man named Don. She always described him the same way and never seemed scared. She'd mention him almost every day. We didn't go to daycare, and we didn't know anyone named Don. Then, one day, something changed. She became terrified. She wouldn't walk around the house alone for fear of running into him, refused to sleep in her own room, and kept saying she hated him because he said mean words to her all the time. About a year into this mean Don phase, we moved into a new house. After that, she never mentioned him again. When my youngest sister was 4, she had an imaginary friend named Yaris. My dad had built her a little playhouse in the backyard, positioned so my mom could watch and hear her from the kitchen. My sister would have tea parties and play with Paris as if he were real. One day, my mom overheard her say, "Don't worry, as long as I'm alive, they won't hurt you." Then she added, "Well, if you do that, then I can't help you. It's not nice to kill people." When my mom asked what she meant, my sister explained, "Sometimes I have to tell Paris to be a nice person, or he can't visit anymore." Not long after that, we moved, and she never got a new playhouse. When my son was around 2 or 3, he often talked about his imaginary friend, Johnny, who wore all green, even a green hat. One day, While we were driving past a cemetery, he pointed out the window and said, "That's where Johnny lives." He was so little that he didn't understand what a cemetery was, so we explained that no one actually lives there. It's a place for people who have died. Then he looked at us seriously and said, "Johnny was a soldier who died in a place called Nam." After my 15-year-old nephew took his own life, my son stopped talking to his imaginary friend for months. My son wasn't even 5 yet, and he was the apple of my nephew's eye. They were incredibly close. My nephew treated him like a little brother, and since his mom often watched my son while I worked, they spent a ton of time together. I had explained to my son that his cousin had been very sad and had died. I reminded him of this before visits, so he wouldn't ask my sister where his cousin was. One day, he said, "Mom, you keep saying he's not here anymore, but he is. He sits on my bed before I go to sleep and talks to me." He was adamant. This went on for months. Somehow, he knew things we never spoke about around him, details we hadn't shared. A few months later, my nephew's grandfather on his dad's side passed away. That's when my son said his cousin told him he wouldn't be able to visit anymore. He was going on a train with his grandpa, and they couldn't come back. The last thing his cousin told him was to never play with guns. They weren't safe. My nephew had taken his own life with a handgun. It completely freaked me out. When my son was around 2 or 3, he had a bunch of imaginary friends. His favorites were Monkey Boy and the Cowboy. One night, when he was 2, he woke up screaming. I ran into his room and found him terrified, pointing to the corner and insisting that Monkey Boy was bad. I ended up picking him up and letting him sleep in my bed that night. Fast forward to when he was 3. We were out for a walk. I was pushing his little sister in her stroller, and he was walking just behind me. He kept saying things like, "Ow wow, stop it, and please stop." I kept looking back, but there was nothing there. I stopped and asked what was hurting him. He said, "The cowboy is hurting me, Mommy." I told him there was no cowboy around. He looked at me seriously and said, "Yes, there is. It's the cowboy in my head. Kids are creepy sometimes." Most of my extended family lives nearby, so we have plenty of gatherings. A bit of backstory. One of my uncles, let's call him Steve, lost a childhood friend when he was about 7. Steve and his friend, Jack, had been playing one afternoon and got a little muddy. Steve's mom gave Jack a pair of Steve's shoes to borrow. When Jack's dad came to pick him up, they forgot to put Jack's own shoes back on, so he left wearing Steve's shoes. Tragically, on the way home, Jack and his father were in a terrible car crash that killed 7-year-old Jack. For some reason, Jack was buried wearing the borrowed shoes. Fast forward about 30 years to a family gathering in 2010. My 6-year-old cousin, Sarah, was playing quietly with toys in a corner of the house. Uncle Steve walked over and asked what she was playing. She replied that she was playing with a friend. Curious, Steve asked who her friend was. Sarah kept playing and said, "I'm playing with your friend Jack, and he says he's sorry he forgot to give your shoes back." Steve nearly dropped his jaw. He hadn't mentioned Jack in years, let alone told this story to a 6-year-old. No one had brought up Jack that day, or at any recent gathering. Every time I think about this, I get chills. A bit late to the party, but here's my story. My mom used to tell me about my imaginary friend when I was little. When I was a baby, she would come check on me in the mornings and sometimes find things in my crib that I had no way of reaching or putting there myself. By the time I was around 5, I started complaining about someone knocking on my bedroom door each night. That's when the story of my imaginary friend came out, a little girl I would play with. My mom asked me to describe her. I told her she wore a long dress, had blonde ringlet hair, and her eyes were rolled back in her head. Cue a very freaked out mom. She tried not to bring it up too much, not wanting to encourage this friend to stick around. A few months later, we were sitting in the front room when I suddenly started crying. My mom asked what was wrong, and I told her that my friend was sitting on her lap, and that wasn't fair because I wanted to sit there instead. My mom never forgave me for the mini heart attack that caused. As I got older, I eventually forgot all about this friend, but my mom would retell the story every now and then. Bonus story. Years later, when my eldest daughter was old enough to talk, she started telling me about her other mom, who would visit her in dreams to check on her and say she missed her. Sometimes my daughter would say she wanted to go with her other mom wherever she went when she left. Edit. There were quite a few strange, ghostly events in that house well into my early 20s. I've always struggled to accept the supernatural, but a lot of things happen that I just can't explain. Edit 2. I spoke to my daughter about her other mom recently, and she doesn't remember her at all. But she did say something strange. I think little sister is other mom. She came back to me. Oddly enough, this other mom stopped visiting a few months before my youngest was even conceived. When I was a kid, I had an imaginary friend named Derek. He was a perfect copy of me, every detail, every movement, like looking in a mirror. I played with him for years, far longer than most kids keep imaginary friends. The strange thing was, Derek always seemed sad when he looked at my mom or my older sister. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Eventually, he disappeared, and I grew up, forgetting about him, until decades later. About 23 years later, I was going through my mom's safe to grab some old paperwork she'd kept for me. That's when I saw it, a stillborn death certificate for a boy named Derek, born on the same day as me. That's when it hit me. Derek wasn't just imaginary. He was my twin, and he had died at birth. Creepy, right? Not exactly an imaginary friend, but my niece as a toddler gave a pretty convincing impression that she was, well, reincarnated. From the moment she could string together her first words, she kept talking about someone named Turtha or Trutha, something unusual like that. Sometimes she even called herself Turtha, and many of her dolls had similar names. By the time she was 2 or 3, she never stopped talking about her other mommy and her sister and how she, Turtha, was in a car accident with them, how her other mommy had died in the hospital. She just wouldn't let it go. My sister didn't push her to stop, but she didn't encourage it either. Every story ended with the same line. Then after my other mommy died, then I was in your stomach. Imagine a tiny kid, big eyes looking up at you, telling you this story as if it were the most natural thing in the world. By the time she was 6, she mostly stopped talking about it. By 8, she had no memory of any of it. We figured she had forgotten her past life, or at least the one she claimed to remember. My cousin once had an imaginary friend she said lived in the fireplace. She described her as red and patchy, like she'd been burned. Apparently, she was a little girl who wore strange clothes that looked like they were from a long time ago. Even now, it still gives me chills. I've shared this before, but when my sister Ashley was younger, she used to be visited at night by a ghostly girl, long dark hair, spider-like hands. Yes, this was long before The Ring came out. Yes, I'm that old. She moved out the second she turned 18 and never looked back. Fast forward about 20 years, our half-brother Trevor moved into her old room. It didn't take long before he was sleeping on the sofa or keeping the lights on. He told us about his new friend he didn't like, a dead girl, same long dark hair, an old nightgown, and spider hands. Needless to say, none of us offered to switch rooms with him. I'm not sure if this counts as an imaginary friend, but this happened when I was around 4 to 6 years old. It was a few months after my grandfather passed away from lung cancer. He had been a smoker, and we were living at my grandmother's house at the time. One day, I was sitting on the couch while my grandmother was talking about her wedding with my grandfather. Out of nowhere, I said, "I was at your wedding." She was surprised and asked me questions about it. Somehow, I answered every single question about their wedding correctly, even though I obviously hadn't been there. Around the same time, I was talking to myself as usual. I've always done that. and my mom walked in and asked who I was talking to. I said, "I'm talking to Pap Pap." A few months later, my family brought it up again, asking if I remembered talking to my grandfather, but I had no memory of it. Then, when I was 8, I remember getting ready for school while my grandma was still asleep. I saw a white figure, the same shape as my grandfather, and I watched him walk into the bathroom. That was the last time I ever saw or spoke to him. I didn't experience this myself, but I read it on a Mumsnet thread about creepy imaginary friends. A parent shared that their 6 or 7-year-old son had an imaginary friend who started out normal enough, but over time began saying things like he didn't like the boy's mom and dad. He even whispered ideas about hurting or upsetting his mom and the family pets, and the boy freely relayed these messages to his mom. At first, the parent tried not to make a fuss, but she discouraged any discussion about the imaginary friend. She could always tell when he was there, because the boy would get this uncomfortable look on his face, especially during family meals. Sometimes she'd ask where the friend was, and the boy would say things like, "He's in the hall and won't come in because you're here. He told me to try and bite you." At those moments, she felt watched, an eerie atmosphere hanging in the house. On a friend's advice, she tried sprinkling salt across doorways, saying prayers, and using herbs to cleanse the house. Gradually, the tension lifted. A few days later, while her son was happily playing in the living room, she asked, just to be sure, "Is the imaginary friend's name not here?" The boy replied, "No." And I'm a bit glad. Trying to keep it light, she said, "Well, that's good then." And then he added something that gave the original poster chills. "But he's just out there," he said, pointing to the front of the house. "And he's watching us through the window." Context: my bedroom was in the attic. When my brother was about 4, he told me about the man who lived in the attic. He said he'd sometimes hear someone walking around up there when I wasn't in my room. One night, he claimed he'd even seen a head peeking out of the attic hatch, watching him. He apologized for being too scared to do anything about the man in my bedroom. I just brushed it off. Over time, he mentioned the man occasionally, but eventually he seemed to grow out of it, and we both forgot about the whole thing. A couple of years later, after I moved out, I asked my brother about taking over the bigger attic bedroom now that it was empty. My youngest brother, only 5 at the time, immediately piped up, "But where will the man live?" When I was little, it was well known in my family that I had an imaginary friend named Other. Other had the same name as me, so I just called him that. I'd tell my mom that Other was being mean to me and even trying to steal Dad's bike. One memory stands out. I told my father that Other was very angry with him for hurting me. My dad was abusive. His response was to throw me across the room. Years later, as an adult, I asked my mom about it. She told me something chilling. My father had a brother I was named after, but no one told me about him. He had died in a motorcycle accident shortly before I was born. When my son was 2, he began waking up in the middle of the night, crying about an orange doggy under his cot. This went on for at least a month. He described the creature as having sharp teeth, stealing his pacifiers, and biting his lips and face until he bled. He's 16 now, and he still remembers it vividly. My baby cousin and her family moved into a new apartment in the Middle East. According to her mom, the little girl would go out onto the balcony and play with someone. She'd talk, run around, and laugh as if she had a companion. When her mom asked who she was playing with, the child said it was her new friend. Concerned, her mom told her not to play there anymore. Later, her dad began feeling a child sitting on his lap whenever he sat on the couch. He could sense the weight and warmth, but there was no one there. They also sometimes heard kids' voices, and things would mysteriously disappear. Not long after, the family moved out. My mom told me that when I was around 3 or 4, I used to do something strange at bedtime. She would tuck me in, and I'd wave at the window. Curious, she asked who I was waving to, and I said, "The man in the window." She looked outside, there was no one there, and asked, "What man?" "There's no one there." I just shrugged and said, "Not yet. He will come," and then went to sleep. After that, we put curtains up on my window, but I kept waving at it every night. My mom had sensor lights in the backyard, but they never triggered. When she asked me about it, I'd say he came to watch over me. Eventually, my mom just assumed it must have been an angel protecting me, since she never saw anyone actually enter the yard. I don't believe in angels, so I've always chalked it up to having an active imagination, but still, it was weird. My mom told me that when I was very young, maybe 3 or 4, I was standing at the window, laughing at something in the front yard. Curious, she asked me what I was laughing at. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "The people dancing outside, with no faces." My mom said she just turned back to the TV, pretending she hadn't asked, and never mentioned it again. I wouldn't exactly call it an imaginary friend, but when I was about 6 to 10, I was convinced that the 2 grumpy old men from the Muppets, Statler and Waldorf, lived in mirrors. I became absolutely terrified of mirrors and would turn them around so I couldn't see my own reflection. I know I freaked my mom out when I told her I did it, so the men in the mirror can't watch me. I'm almost 20 now, and obviously I've outgrown the fear, but I still sometimes catch myself turning mirrors so I can't see my reflection. Often, I don't even realize I'm doing it. My cousin had an imaginary friend he called Monkey Man. One day, my aunt asked him why he was called that, and he said it was because he just hangs in the corner of the room. That freaked her out. He would always wave at the window when leaving and say, "Monkey Man is hanging at the window." Eventually, my aunt did some digging and discovered that the houses in that neighborhood were built over old mine shafts, and suicides were apparently common there. Even now, I still get that uneasy feeling like someone's watching whenever I walk past. One evening, I was taking my 3-year-old niece out for ice cream. I strapped her into her car seat in the back. As I started driving, she asked if Jacob, her imaginary friend, could have ice cream too. I laughed and said, "Jacob can get his own ice cream. Just kidding, we'll get him one too." She didn't respond, so I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was dark, so I couldn't see much, just her face. But she looked angry, and when I opened my mouth to reassure her I was joking, I noticed she wasn't looking at me. She was staring past my shoulder, toward the back of the car. Then she said quietly but firmly, "I said no, Jacob. Be nice." No. She didn't mean it. When my son was around 3, he had an imaginary friend named Wally. One night, he woke up crying and said Wally was looking in his window, but this time, Wally's face was missing. I ended up letting him sleep in our bed that night, after doing a full perimeter check around the house, just to be safe. Kids really are creepy little creatures sometimes. When my cousin and I were kids, she casually mentioned that she had a friend named Harold who lived in the picture frames. Their hallway was completely lined with frames, and she would always hold her breath when she walked past them. One day, we were hanging out in their unfinished basement. She pointed to a beam in the far back corner and, without hesitation, said, "That's where Harold sleeps." My son had an imaginary friend who he said was an angel. I'd always heard stories about angels convincing kids to follow them, so I was instantly uneasy whenever he talked about this one. Later, I discovered that a child had apparently drowned in the tiny pond tucked away in the far corner of our yard. It made me wonder, was this angel the spirit of that child, looking for a playmate? Needless to say, I had that pond filled in with dirt, fast. My sister works with children, and one time she was in charge of a class that was convinced there was a ghost at their school. Curious, she asked them where the ghost was, and every single one of them pointed to the exact same spot. I think these were kindergartners, so while I'm not usually superstitious, it seems far less likely that an entire class of 4-year-olds could coordinate that as a prank than that. Maybe, just maybe, there really was something in that classroom. Not scary, but definitely unnerving. When my daughter was about 3 or 4, she came out of her room at my mom's and asked if Grandpa Ken could have a sleepover in her room because he was tired of being in the dark. She went to the spot where my mom kept his ashes, picked up the urn, and brought it into her room. She would play with him and have full conversations with him regularly. That alone was odd, but then one day we were out shopping. She approached an elderly man and started chatting with him, calling him Sonny, and saying how glad she was that he could breathe again. The man humored her and played along. Later, my mom spoke with him, and he repeated things my daughter had said, things only someone familiar with her Grandpa Ken would know. The man looked remarkably like my grandfather, whose nickname was Sonny. Grandpa Ken had died from anaphylactic shock from a bee sting over 27 years earlier, long before I was born. We had no photos of him. My mom had never discussed him, and no one outside our family knew his nickname. About a year later, my daughter told us that Grandpa Ken said he had to go be with his wife, and that now, knowing his girls were safe, he wouldn't be coming back. She's never mentioned him since. I haven't thought about this in a while, but when my son was around 6, he had an imaginary friend named Akiki. Akiki was a skeleton man, but oddly enough, my son only ever had nice things to say about him. Even as a skeleton, he wasn't scary at all. When my son was 3, he had an imaginary friend he called Dark. He would whisper things like, "Hear it? See it?" And when we asked what he meant, he'd just say, "Dark." The strange part was that he only ever mentioned dark in one room, our basement. He said Dark didn't like it when he told us about him. Eventually, he told us that Dark even had a dog named Keeper. After we had the house blessed, my son never mentioned Dark or Keeper again. When I was little, my sisters and I lived in a very old house in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. According to my mom, each of us had an imaginary friend we called the little brown boy. I was the first to see him, then my next sister, then the next, and by the time the last sister saw him, the others had long forgotten about him. At first, he was always super nice, and we would happily play with him. But then, out of nowhere, we would become terrified of him and refuse to go into our rooms, where he apparently lived. We were all around 4 years old when we saw him. A few years later, we moved out, but the next family said their little daughter also had an imaginary friend she called the mean boy. When my older brother was about 3 or 4, back in the late 70s, he told my mom very matter-of-factly that there was a ghost living behind the TV at my grandma's house. You know, one of those old floor models. He said the ghost was friendly, kind of like Casper, but insisted it wasn't Casper. Over the years, lots of strange things have been heard and seen in that house. Later, my youngest son, barely old enough to babble, would sometimes sound like he was speaking full sentences. Multiple people witnessed it. Once he got a bit older and could actually talk, he would casually mention the man in my closet. He never seemed afraid, so I just thought, okay, cool. Okay, so this one's pretty creepy. I'm an adult who doesn't really believe in ghosts, but thinking back on this experience makes me wonder, what the hell was going on? I wouldn't exactly call it a friend, but when I was about 12, I lived with my brother and his family. We moved into a new house, and my youngest niece, she was maybe 4 or 5 at the time, always avoided one particular corner in the family room. She said it was because of the green lady. Most of the time, it was just that one corner, though sometimes she claimed the green lady moved slightly. Her older sister, about 9, liked to tease her. She'd throw toys into that corner, and my little niece would avoid it like it was radioactive. One day, the older sister actually pushed her into that corner. I swear, I have never in my life heard a scream like that. It was blood-curdling, pure terror, the kind of scream you hope to never hear again. She didn't run. She was backed into the corner, staring upward, frozen in fear. After that, my niece never teased her sister about that corner again, and honestly, none of us messed with it either. When friends came over, we'd jokingly say, "Oh, stay away from that corner. We're pretty sure an evil ghost lives there." Nobody ever took it seriously, except something clearly was there. Here's the really messed up part. According to my niece, the green lady didn't like it when my brother and his wife discussed moving. At bedtime, she would follow them into their room. Later, when my sister-in-law got pregnant, the green lady moved into the nursery and stayed there. We lived in that house for about 2.5 years. During that time, terrible things kept happening. My sister-in-law was having twins, but lost one. The surviving twin was born with spinal meningitis and other serious health issues. He stayed in the hospital for at least a month. My sister-in-law developed cervical cancer. Her mom, who uses a walker, fell in the pool and injured herself. Pets kept dying or getting seriously sick. A golden retriever, a cocker spaniel, a cat, a guinea pig, and some rats. The dogs got cancerous tumors, the cat was hit by a car, the guinea pig got sick, and a rat died from being left in a hot cage. When we finally moved out, we all agreed that something about that house was deeply wrong. Whatever the green lady was, she was malevolent, and we're pretty sure she caused much of the chaos and misfortune while we lived there. Not exactly an imaginary friend, but creepy enough to count. My daughter is 2, and ever since she learned to talk, she's always chatted to herself in her crib as she drifts off. It's adorable, usually harmless stuff like, "Go see Nana," "Go see Papa," "Hello, Annie," "Hello, Tim," her aunt and uncle. My wife and I would listen on the baby monitor and just marvel at how cute she was. Then one night, she said, "Satan." In that sweet, sing-songy little girl voice, it was somehow both innocent and bone-chilling. Over the next week, it evolved. It's Satan. Satan and the sun. Or my personal favorite. "Good night, everyone." "Ah, Satan." We were baffled until my wife figured it out. Our daughter loves the book Good Night, Everyone, and is obsessed with the planets. The book ends with "Good night, everyone," followed by illustrations of the solar system. They go from the outer planets to the sun, and she would gleefully call out Saturn, probably because its rings made it easy to spot. So, yes, it wasn't Satan. Just a little 2-year-old mishearing Saturn. But for a week, it was genuinely creepy. Not exactly an imaginary friend, but I hope that's all it was. When my child was around 2 or 3, she started talking about her other family. She would tell us how much she missed them and that she worried about them. According to her, she had a mom, a dad, a brother, and a sister. Odd, because she was an only child at the time. Whenever we asked questions, her answers were always the same, detailed and consistent. It was really creepy. She would say that her other family sometimes came to visit her. Whenever she talked about them, I'd reassure her that she could tell them she's safe and happy, so they wouldn't need to worry. She seemed comforted by that, and it made me feel better too. Even though it was strange, it was sweet in a way, like a little window into a world we couldn't see. So, my son had an imaginary friend named Bored, or maybe Bored. Honestly, I never got a straight answer. I can only imagine the first time he asked his name, and the friend just replied, "I'm bored." He met Bored when we moved into an old house. The friend was unsettling, to say the least. He had mean cats, and supposedly lived in the walls. Sometimes he liked my son. Other times, he would be angry with him for being mean or not letting him sleep. Bored would occasionally lock my son's bedroom door, refusing to let anyone in or out. It was genuinely creepy. But most of the time, they just played outside together, though sometimes Bored tried to coax him into dangerous spots, like the road. Then one day, we were walking past the cemetery near our house. My son wandered into the trees and pointed to a small circle of them, 5 or 6 tall, 8-foot trees, and said, "That's where Bored is from." I looked closer, and barely visible beneath the overgrowth, there was a gravestone tucked among the trees and vines. We moved not long after that. Bored never followed. My nephew used to say the strangest, most heartbreaking things when he was little. From about age 3 until he was 8, he would talk about a life that didn't match his own at all. He was born and raised in Seattle, had never traveled outside the country, and hadn't even gone to daycare. Our family is Indian, and he had never been to Africa. But he would often talk about back home in Africa, where he said he had 8 brothers and sisters. Sometimes he'd grow quiet and sad when he spoke about them. He described living together in a mud house, never having enough food or water. Even so, he would say he missed them, especially playing together. It was confusing and emotional to hear, the way he spoke about it so sincerely, as if he were remembering something real. It wasn't exactly scary, just deeply strange. I once met a kid who had survived a drowning accident. He was absolutely convinced that a fish had saved his life. He told the story with total certainty, saying the fish had guided him or pushed him back towards safety. After that, he became obsessed. He believed he owed fish a debt. It turned into his life's mission to repay them. He kept getting into trouble for stealing goldfish crackers from stores, then sneaking off to dump them into ponds and lakes as some kind of offering. He was hospitalized more than once because he just wouldn't let it go. It wasn't horror movie scary, just the unsettling kind of story that sticks with you. When I was little, I had an imaginary friend named Flora. I never mentioned her to my younger siblings. We're 8 years apart, and by the time they were old enough to talk much, Flora felt like an irrelevant piece of my childhood. Back then, though, I was convinced she followed me everywhere. I even believed she moved objects around my room. I eventually grew out of it. About a month ago, something strange happened. I was sitting in my room when I noticed one of my little sister's stuffed animals propped up in the doorway. It caught my attention because it hadn't been there before. The only other person home was my 6-year-old sister, and she was in the bath. I could see the bathroom from my room. She was fine and supervised. I asked her why her stuffed animal was in my doorway. She looked genuinely confused and said she had no idea what I was talking about. And she's 6. She's not exactly good at lying. I brushed it off, tossed the stuffed animal back into her room, and didn't think much of it. Later, I heard her crying. When I checked on her, she was sitting on her bedroom floor, talking toward the wall. I asked what was wrong, and through tears she said, "Flora ripped my stuffed animal in half." The toy was on the ground beside her, torn. We don't have any pets. No one else was home. And she said the name Flora like it meant something. My little sister had an imaginary friend from the time she was 2 until she was about 5. She called him Rhymy Guy. According to her, he was half hamster, half man, about 6 inches tall, and he only spoke in rhymes. For a while, it was just one of those quirky kid things. Then one night, in the middle of dinner, she suddenly started panicking. We asked what was wrong, and she told us, completely serious, that Rhymy Guy had jumped into her mouth and she'd accidentally swallowed him. About an hour later, she began complaining that her stomach and chest hurt because Rhymy Guy was eating her insides. For the next week or so, she insisted she was in pain. She'd say she was trying to poop him out, but that he kept crawling back in. It was unsettling, to say the least. After that, she said Rhymy Guy wasn't her friend anymore. She became afraid to fall asleep because she thought he might crawl back inside her. Every night, my mom had to pretend to take him out of the room just to calm her down enough to sleep. Then, around 5:30, she casually announced that Rhymy Guy had left to find another girl to climb inside of. Kids' imaginations are incredible and sometimes absolutely terrifying. When I was about 15 or 16, I went through months of waking up in the middle of the night and seeing something in my room. In the top right corner, near the door, there was always what I can only describe as a black mist. It never moved from that spot. It was roughly 3 feet wide, like a dense patch of smoke. But if I focused on it, it didn't look like normal mist. It felt like something was inside it, curled up, completely black, with what looked like red eyes staring out. Sometimes I saw it during sleep paralysis. Other times, I was fully awake. I never told my family. I figured they'd think I was losing it. But it terrified me. A few years later, I was talking with my mom about random things, and somehow we got onto the subject of psychics. She told me that when she was younger, she'd gone to a party where a woman claiming to be psychic was introduced to her. When they shook hands, the woman apparently went pale and wide-eyed. She abruptly told my mom's friend she had to leave. She refused to stay in the house with my mom. Before leaving, she looked at my mom and said, "You have something following you. There's a black cloud above your head." My mom always brushed it off as nonsense, just some rude woman being dramatic, maybe drunk or high. Years passed. I was about 24. My mom still lived in the same house, and by then I had a 3-year-old little sister. She was sleeping in what used to be my bedroom. One day, I was chatting with my mom and one of her friends when my mom casually asked, "Hey, didn't you used to have really bad nightmares when you lived here?" "Yeah," I said. "That's putting it lightly." She nodded. "That's strange. I think your sister might be having them now too." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Well," she said, completely calm, "she keeps talking about her imaginary friend. She says it's a black rain cloud in her room that talks to her at night." I felt frozen in place. I had never told anyone what I saw. Not the shape. Not the location. Not the color. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked, "Did she say where the cloud is?" My mom nodded. "Yeah. She says it's always in the top right corner of the room. By the door." When I was about 7 or 8 months pregnant with my third child, my 3-year-old son started talking about an imaginary friend named Grayson. Around that same time, his behavior changed dramatically. He became so difficult and unpredictable that I occasionally asked his grandparents to take him for a while just so I could catch my breath. It felt like it all happened overnight. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen talking on the phone with a friend, venting about how out of control he'd been lately. She gently suggested maybe we should look into a therapist. I remember feeling defensive and brushing the idea off. Right after I insisted he was fine, my son walked out of his bedroom and came straight up to me. Calmly, almost casually, he said, "Grayson told me that I should stab you." Then he smiled. It wasn't a normal little kid grin. It made my skin crawl. Not long after that, we ended up moving to a different house. Strangely, once we did, the behavior stopped. The imaginary friend disappeared. Everything went back to normal. He's 12 now, completely well-adjusted, kind, and no different from any other kid his age. And the strangest part? He doesn't remember any of it. This isn't my story. It's something I heard in a YouTube clip from a supernatural convention panel. I can't remember exactly which actor was telling it. I think it might have been Misha, but he shared a story about one of his kids and their imaginary friend. Apparently, the child announced one day that they had killed their imaginary friend because the friend had said a bad word. The way he told it was meant to be funny, but there was something unexpectedly dark about it. The idea of a little kid casually deciding their imaginary companion deserved to die for swearing was unsettling, to say the least. When I was little, my mom heard me talking to someone and came to see what was going on. There was no one there. When she asked who I'd been speaking to, I described my late grandmother in perfect detail, and not just her, but my mother's grandmother too. I even knew her name. The strangest part? I'd never met or seen a photo of her. My mom was completely spooked. There was a kid in my apartment complex who was always wandering around. His parents clearly weren't keeping a close eye on him. No 5-year-old should be roaming alone, especially in that neighborhood. One day, I came home from work wearing my ABUs, Air Force camo, and the kid ran up to me. "Are you in the Army?" he asked. I said yes. It seemed simpler than explaining the differences between branches to a 5-year-old. Then he asked, "Have you ever shot anyone?" I told him no, that I mostly work on computers. That's when he started describing, in startling detail, how his friend had been shot in the head in Nam, and how his brains had splattered on him. I was caught off guard. What 5-year-old should know something like that? I said, "Oh man, I'm sorry, that sounds rough." He nodded solemnly, said, "Yeah," and walked away. Kids really do say the darndest things.